So you need to figure out, though, how much of what they're experiencing physically and emotionally now as an adult, how much of it is explained by the kinds of abuse or violence that they experienced. So if it's almost none of it is explained by that, well then that's going to affect your care. But if a lot of what they're experiencing in terms of their physical and mental health symptoms is explained by the different kinds of abuse and neglect that they had as a child and their trauma symptoms, then it makes a difference in your clinical practice. We also, because our model was such that we looked at, we thought that the non-contact violence would predict contact violence and that the contact violence would predict trauma symptoms. The reason that's important is, as a psych nurse, I know that I'm going to treat something differently if I'm dealing with abuse without trauma symptoms. But if I have trauma symptoms, I definitely have to use a trauma-focused kind of therapy, which will be a little bit different than my the kind of practice I might use for perhaps an interpersonal approach or a cognitive approach or whatever. So your choice of therapies is based on how much of these physical and mental health symptoms the person's experiencing is based on trauma symptoms, how much of what they're experiencing is based on some of the abuse that you might want to deal with relationally. So when we did the model and then we tested this model against the data that we collected from these 160 women, what we found was essentially there were a lot of regression lines that were predictive, but the thing that was most predictive was emotional abuse that the client experienced when they were a kid through trauma symptoms. And so as you look at the lines here, you can see that the trauma symptoms themselves were most predictive of physical symptoms and perceived mental health, and that there was not a direct line, for example, from emotional abuse directly to perceived health. And so what that tells us is that when you're a clinician, you've got to deal with the trauma symptoms with trauma therapy, and that you should not rely on the idea that, oh, this person didn't experience sexual abuse, so that's probably not what's going on. Emotional abuse was the one kind of a type of maltreatment that really was most predictive of these symptoms that we see later in life, which is why we got published in the Journal of Emotional Abuse, because I think a lot of people think clinically, well, they weren't sexually abused, they weren't physically abused, therefore why are we dealing with all these symptoms later in life? But in this sample, what we were able to see was that our emotional abuse was where we saw the largest proportion of the explained variability in scores. So if you had the more severe your emotional abuse, the more predictive it was of other kinds of abuse and also of the trauma symptoms and therefore the perceived mental health and the perceived physical health. So we wouldn't have known that, and we would still be doing EEGs, EKGs, CAT scans, MRIs, and everything else. But in this sample we were able to show, and it verified other studies in the past that have seen that if you have sexual abuse, for example, you can explain a lot of the variability in physical and mental health symptoms through the sexual abuse. But we were also able to show that emotional abuse is really carries a lot of the weight in terms of why, through trauma symptoms, that when they're emotionally abused, they actually do have trauma symptoms that are predictive of their mental and physical health later in life. I think that's pretty cool.
Is there anything that you'd like to add?
I don't think so, except that I do think that for advanced practice nursing students, I do think that to get a real sense of how you're going to contribute to your clients' lives and how you're going to really make a difference for them, you really are not going to make a difference if you take what you've learned in your classes when you leave here and you just run with that for the rest of your years as a practitioner. You're going to have to get what's going on in the stats class so that you can understand the research that comes out through the many years of your practice. Nothing, I've been a nurse for 42 years almost, nothing in mental health and how we work with mental health clients is the same really as it was 42 years ago, except for the fact that we care very much about our relationships with our patients, and we use a lot of our interpersonal skills to assess our patients. But beyond that, how we even think theoretically about mental illness has changed dramatically in 42 years. So you're going to have to keep up, you're going to have to change, which means you're going to have to read the research, which means you're going to have to know the statistics to understand what you're reading.
Right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.